come and hear the lecture today. On behalf of the University of Scranton Catholic Studies program, the Jesuit Center here at the University of Scranton, and our own Theology, Religious Studies department, I would like to welcome you. And I'd also like to extend a special welcome to students out there and those who are actively involved in research and academic inquiry where this topic for today is of particular interest, faith and reason. The topic for the title for today's talk is The Wild and Wonderful Marriage of Faith and Reason, a historical story. The topic is of utmost importance, especially to those of us who are seeking after truth here at the university level. And it is perhaps the most important question that we can ask. The Superior General of the Jesuits, Pedro Arrupe, once said that nothing is more practical than finding God. Here at this Jesuit institution, we presume that there is some connection between our studies, our practical professional training, and the question of God and of faith. Also, this question is inexhaustible. It's never something that we will tire of inquiring into. The discovery of God's presence in all things isn't the end of our questioning, it's only the beginning. It opens up a new horizon to us and provides our reason with new confidence and energy. And there's no better guide to exploring this question than our present speaker today, Dr. Peter Kreeft. He's the author of over 60 books, mostly in the fields of theology and philosophy, with titles ranging from Summa Philosophica to I Surf, Therefore I Am. He has also published works on the fiction of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, and has recently just published his first novel, entitled Ocean Full of Angels. The mark of a true philosopher, I would submit, is the way in which they pursue questions, the way in which they ask and speak about the questions that are most important. This ability to speak we call in the Jesuit zone eloquentia perfecta. And those of you who are looking for a model of eloquentia perfecta need look no further than Professor Kreeft. His speaking ability is perhaps the truest mark of his philosophical skill. He has given multiple audio courses, which I highly recommend, through the Modern Scholar Company, and has given innumerable lectures all over the country, including debates. And through these, even though I just met him today, I feel as though I know him, because we share common passions and common objects of delight. In addition to serving as a professor at Boston College, another Jesuit institution in Massachusetts, since 1965, Dr. Kreeft is also a distinguished visiting professor of philosophy at the King's College in New York City. During his career, he has taught at more than 15 colleges across the United States, and he is here today at the University of Scranton. And so we are delighted and honored to have him speak with us here today on the wild and wonderful marriage of faith and reason. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Kreeft.
Thank you, Dr. Clark, for such flattering fibs. I should like to begin by placing my subject in a large historical context. The fundamental intellectual project of Christian culture is the marriage of faith and reason. Historically and culturally, this began with the merging of biblical Judeo-Christian culture with classical Greco-Roman culture, the two great traditions in the ancient world which have survived and have formed that civilization which used to be called Christendom and is now called simply Western civilization, both by its defenders and its cultured despisers, and which is perhaps most accurately called apostate Christendom. The two most salient facts about this civilization is that it is ours and that it is rapidly committing intellectual and spiritual suicide. We feel a little bit like a child whose mother is killing herself by leaving her husband and whoring after men with toxic drug habits. And if we don't feel like that, that's even worse. It means the child has been drugged too. The marriage of these two cultures was the marriage of two historically new ways of thinking: faith and reason. We easily forget how new these two roots of our civilization were in the ancient world. The two languages of these two cultures contained many words that expressed concepts that had never occurred to any human minds before, concepts that simply did not exist in any other culture. For instance, the word bara in Hebrew, which meant to create something out of nothing, a feat impossible to nature and to man and to all other gods except the Hebrew God. Another radically new concept was sin, which meant not merely moral evil, but the breaking of the uniquely intimate covenant relationship with God, the relationship that no other culture knew. If you don't understand the intimacy of marriage, you don't understand the suicidal tragedy of divorce. Still another unique Hebrew concept was the revealed name of God, I am, the identification of I with am, subject with object, person with being, a moral will with something eternally perfect. None of these concepts could be found anywhere else in the world. And in the Greek language, we also have unique concepts like science and logic and essence and nature and substance and accident. The radical newness of these two cultures is revealed in two words, the word Gentiles and the word barbarians. The Jews and the Greeks were so distinctive that each of them had a word for all other cultures. All mankind were either Jews or Gentiles, either Greeks or barbarians. There were only two kinds of people, not many. To the Greeks, the Jews were simply one kind of barbarians. To the Jews, the Greeks were simply one kind of Gentiles. The single most life-changing and history-changing distinctiveness of these two cultures consisted in two new ways of thinking about everything. These two new ways of thinking changed history. They were faith and reason. We who have forgotten history have forgotten how radically new these two things were. Alas, Santayana was wrong when he said those who have forgotten history are doomed to repeat it. They're not doomed to repeat it. That would be something of a privilege. Divorcees do not become virgins. What were these two new ways of thinking and how were they radically new? What faith had meant for all Gentile religions was simply something private, esoteric, and unverifiable. But what faith meant for the Jews and for the Christians who learned from them was something quite different, something exoteric and public, something available to all and demanded of all. It was expressed not in mystical experiences of shamans, but in words and deeds, the words of the prophets and the public miracles of salvation history. Judaism was not just a new religion, but a new kind of religion, a new kind of faith. An equally new kind of reason was discovered by the Greeks. What reason or wisdom had meant for all barbarian cultures was the purely practical wisdom that leaked down by osmosis from tradition and authority and was mediated by the few authority figures, the seers. Just as faith became public and egalitarian and objective in Israel, so reason became public and egalitarian and objective in Greece. When Socrates, that paragon of reason, appeared on the scene in Athens and won every argument he ever engaged in because he clearly understood for the first time what logic was and how it had the authority to interpret and judge even the highest traditions of its culture, the gods of Homer and Hesiod, he appeared to his fellow Greeks as a new kind of man, a wizard, such a threatening one that he had to be executed. Any marriage between Gentile religions and barbarian philosophies would have been impossible. because there was no common meeting point. Both were irrational, elitist, private, and subjective. But the marriage between Jewish religion and Greek philosophy was possible because both were rational, egalitarian, public, and objective. Both Jewish religion and Greek philosophy affected the whole world, unlike Gentile religions or barbarian philosophies, but only through Christianity and the Roman Empire. Jewish religion affected the whole world through Christianity, which is a missionary religion, unlike Judaism, which does not proselytize until the Messiah comes. Greek philosophy affected the whole world through Rome, which provided the body that carried the Greek mind everywhere after the Greek political body was absorbed into the omnivorous Roman stomach. Rome produced no important new philosophy, but revered the Greek mind even after conquering the Greek body. Throughout the history of Rome, rich parents imported philosophers from Greece to educate their children. If an extraterrestrial sociologist with materialistic leanings had been studying Earth in the 6th century BC, he probably would never have predicted that 99% of the future of the West would depend on these two little postage stamp-sized civilizations, Israel and Greece. That should give us a clue as to how much we should trust our current prophets. Our first photo of this wedding is in the prologue of John's Gospel. Here we see the wedding night of the marriage and the conception of its embryo. For here we see the two becoming one. Both are called logos. The divine sperm is the logos of God, the word of God, the mind of God, which became flesh. The human egg is the logos of Greek philosophy, the truth sought by all the philosophers. The marriage was like an equation. The logos equals Jesus Christ. John identified the very center of classical culture, the logos sought by the philosophers, the eternal ultimate truth, the meaning of all things, with the very center of Christian culture, the concrete historical person of Jesus Christ, the divine Logos incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, which had become this very finite mortal man. And the Word became flesh. The Logos became sarx, a Greek word which means the human soul and mind as well as the human body. When John wrote his fateful equation, it was like Einstein's equation of matter with energy. And the energy that was released transformed the world even more than nuclear energy. The equation, Jesus equals the Logos, was not the Hellenization of Christianity, but the Christianization of Greek philosophy. Man did not impregnate God, God impregnated man. That is why the God of Christianity and Judaism is never symbolized as a she, only a he. All of Christian culture is an extension of the incarnation. Philosophy is an essential part of it, because philosophy consciously reflects on it and its meaning, seeking its definition and its rational defense. Many great minds contributed to this enterprise of Christian philosophy, but the greatest of them all, according to the definitive teaching of the Church herself, as articulated by the Council of Trent and almost every single pope since Leo XIII, is St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas answers almost every question by making a distinction. So, my second point, after this long historical introduction, is the distinction between three aspects of the faith-reason question. The first aspect takes faith and reason to be timeless objective truths, the truths knowable by faith and the truths knowable by reason. This is the aspect of a question that St. Thomas dealt with. A second aspect could take both faith and reason to be temporal, historical, subjective acts of the human soul. This is the more typical modern meaning of faith and reason. Faith here involves both intellectual belief and personal trust and commitment. The latter is the religious faith that saves us because it allows God to impregnate our souls with his divine life, Zoe. The other sense, intellectual belief, is a necessary but not sufficient part of this larger faith. It is not sufficient because, as St. James says, the devils also believe but tremble with fear. A third possible aspect would take both faith and reason to be human, cultural, historical entities, something like Adam and Eve, whose names refer not only to historical individuals, our first parents, but also to all mankind throughout history. This is why St. Paul does not say that we are punished for another man's sin, but that we all sinned in Adam. Now, the first of these three meanings of faith and reason is what St. Thomas dealt with at the beginning of both of his summas, when he asked about the relationship between faith and reason. He meant by these two things two ideal objective entities, two essences, rather than historical, actual, concrete human acts, whether individual or cultural. Thus, faith meant for him all the objective truths that we can know by faith, and reason meant all the objective truths that we can know by reason. St. Thomas then asked the question how these two kinds of truths, or sets of true propositions, are related to each other. That is a very easy question to answer, because it is a happy, clean, bright question. And St. Thomas gave an easy, happy, clean, and bright answer to it. It is an objective and ideal question, typical of the pre-modern mind, which is like the mind of a child who keeps asking, "What is that? What is that?" And his answer is twofold. First of all, the relationship is that there can never be any contradiction between any truth known by faith and any truth known by reason, because the same God is the author of both, and this God never contradicts himself. The medievals loved to say that God wrote two books, Scripture and Nature, or natural reason. And both, rightly interpreted, are always true. And truth never contradicts truth, only error contradicts truth. Therefore, there has never been, and never can be, any real contradiction between any divinely revealed Christian doctrine and any truth discovered by human reason, by science, history, philosophy, or common sense. All apparent contradictions are based on errors, and those errors can always, in principle, be unmasked and corrected by human reason, because they are errors of reason. Thus, the supposed conflict between science and religion has no more real existence than zombies. The second part of St. Thomas's answer is that these two sets of truths are partially independent, that they overlap, so that some truths of faith, like the Trinity, cannot in principle be discovered and understood or proved by unaided human reason, but that other truths of reason, like the existence, unity, intelligence, and goodness of the uncaused cause, can. And that some truths of reason, like the discoveries of the natural sciences, form no part of divine revelation, but that others, like the order of the universe and the uniqueness of human consciousness, do form part of divine revelation. In other words, there are three kinds of truths. Truths knowable by faith alone, truths knowable by both faith and reason, and truths knowable by natural reason alone. Now, that is a very clear and very reasonable answer. It is one of only 5 possible answers. For logically, there are only 5 possible answers to any question about the relationship between any two things or classes of things: separation, identity, assimilation to the first thing, assimilation to the second thing, or partial overlapping. And all 4 of the other logical possibilities here, or all 4 alternatives to St. Thomas's overlapping answer, are unreasonable. First, the total separation of the two denies the middle mixed category, which exists. The total identity of the two denies both the first and the third categories. That is, it denies the independence of some of each from the other. Third, the total subordination of faith to reason denies any independence to faith. And finally, the total subordination of reason to faith denies any independence to reason. Well, that's a very short summary of St. Thomas's answer to the question of the relationship between faith and reason. There is no other better answer to the question as he conceived it. But there are other questions, that is, other ways to conceive the question. A second way to conceive the question is to mean by the relationship between faith and reason the lived relationship between the exercised act of faith and exercised acts of reason within the personal psychology of an individual. Now, this is a much less easy question, and also a less happy, bright, and clean question. It is complex, problematic, dark, and messy. It is a question for psychologists, not philosophers. This is the typically modern question, since the typically modern mind, for better or for worse, or both, is subjectivistic and psychologistic and relativistic and individualistic rather than metaphysical and objectivistic. It's the mind of a teenager who keeps asking not so much what's that, as who am I? Therefore, since I am no longer a teenager, I will not delve into this aspect of the question. Finally, we could mean a third thing when we ask about the relationship between faith and reason, and this is what I want to explore now. This is the historical epic of the changing relationship between these two things in the life of mankind on earth. This is subjective and psychological, like our second question, but it's not individualistic. And it shows a clear pattern, rather than being really messy and relative to different individuals. Many things have been written about the first two aspects of the relationship between faith and reason, so I'd like to sketch a big picture outline of the third aspect for the rest of my talk. To do this, I will now personify these two things, faith and reason, and make them protagonists in an allegorical drama. I will give them human names. To be very original, I will call them Adam and Eve. There are no two more original names than these. Often the key to being truly original is to ignore the demand to be original. And often the key to being symbolic rather than just allegorical, that is, to have a resonating sounding board of many echoing meanings rather than only one correct meaning, like the solution to a puzzle, is to invent an allegory. I will also dare to be sexist and identify Adam with reason and Eve with faith, because it is obvious to anyone not corrupted by politically correct ideology that men tend to value reason more than women do, and women tend to value faith more than men do. There are thousands of devastatingly accurate and therefore devastatingly funny jokes about this. But I will tell none of them here so that you can come and talk to me later if you want to hear some terrible male and female chauvinist jokes. Adam and Eve have gone through 3 stages in their life so far in history. These are the 3 stages of every story ever told. They are the essential structure of story as such. In all stories, a situation is first set up, then upset in some way, then reset in some way, either happily or unhappily or both. Theologians call these stages creation, fall, and redemption. All 3 are already present by the 3rd chapter of Genesis. The first of the 3 stages is the perfect, innocent, primordial unity or marriage between Adam and Eve, that is, reason and faith. This historical era ended with the fall, but it must have been a real historical era, whether it lasted a millennium or a day. For if it was not, then the good God must have created mankind already in the state of sin and evil and separation and divorce, which is absurd. In this first stage, the creation of mankind perfect in Eden, all the things that St. Thomas claims to be true in principle, or de jure, about the relation between faith and reason, are also true in practice, de facto. First of all, Adam and Eve, reason and faith, look at each other with wonder and respect. They are in love. They find each other beautiful. They have faith in each other. They trust each other, and therefore they understand each other's reason. In the second place, they are fit for each other like a jigsaw puzzle. They are complementary. They complete each other. Adam calls Eve flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. First, woman is taken out of man. Subsequently, every man is born by being taken out of woman. Adam and Eve, reason and faith, perfect each other. Reason makes faith more profound, and faith makes reason more profound. In the third place, the two become one without losing their two-ness, their difference. Adam and Eve, reason and faith, are neither confused nor separated, but overlapping, so that each has something the other does not have. Thus, many truths known by reason are not known by faith, like the truths of natural science, and many truths known by faith are not known by reason, that is, not comprehensible or discoverable or provable by reason alone, the three acts of the mind, like the Trinity. And yet the two are one, because all truth forms a whole, as men and women do. Adam and Eve together constitute the image of God. All men, male and female, are God's, and all truths of faith and reason are God's truths. Finally, there is no possible contradiction or war between faith and reason, as there is none between Eve and Adam, when both are in their innocent, ideal, and natural state. How could there be? God is the author of both, and God never contradicts himself. The second stage, historically, is the fall. First of faith, then of reason, then of the marriage between them. In Genesis 2, there is a threefold fall, first of Eve, then of Adam, then of the relationship between them. It is significant that faith falls first, then reason. This is also the order of their restoration, which begins with a woman, Mary, the new Eve. The cause of the spiritual divorce between Adam and Eve was their spiritual divorce from God, who was the source of their union. Once they fell from God, they immediately fell from each other, from their marriage. They hid from each other because they hid from God. They passed the buck by blaming each other because they both blamed God. Adam blamed God for giving him Eve, and Eve blamed God for letting the snake in the grass. And in the history of Western thought, too, as we shall see soon, faith fell first, then reason, then the marriage between them. All four features of the marriage that I mentioned in stage 1 are reversed by the divorce in stage 2. First of all, it begins with mistrust replacing trust. This happened in philosophy with what philosophers call the hermeneutic of suspicion, or what Descartes called methodic doubt, which replaced methodic faith as the relationship to truth. In other words, Descartes replaced Socrates. And it had happened earlier in Eden with Eve's distrust replacing trust as her new relationship with God. The fall was first of all a fall of faith, of trust, doubting God and suspecting that the devil might be more trustable as a truth teller. Then Adam followed Eve down instead of leading her out and up. The same happened to faith and reason historically. Once faith fell, reason fell too. As they had stood together, they fell together. And when they fell together, they fell apart. And this is the second aspect of the fall. Instead of complementing and completing and perfecting each other, they threatened and blamed each other. Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed Satan, and both blamed God. Each sought to hide from the other because each sought to hide from God. And the same happened to the relation between reason and faith in history. Reason began to see itself as self-justifying, as foundational, as in Descartes. And the result of this rationalism was the crisis of reason throughout modern philosophy. And faith also began to see itself as self-justifying, as a world unto itself, as a human psychological experience or feeling, which was the end, with God as a mere means to this end, as in Schleiermacher or Rousseau. And this is as self-destructive to faith as reason's attempt at self-justifying autonomy is to reason. Faith in faith replaced faith in God. You can't sell faith in faith to real people, only to professional theologians. Like the one in C.S. Lewis's story about the theologian who died and met God at the gates of heaven, and God gave him the choice between entering heaven or entering a theology lecture on heaven, and of course he chose the lecture. Third, faith and reason no longer overlap, nor do they respect each other's domain and individuality. Their areas are confused and fought over. Each attempts to shrink rather than expand the domain of the other. Thus, religion becomes suspicious of philosophy and of science and trashes their authority. And science and philosophy do exactly the same to religion. And that is the most obvious difference between medieval and modern philosophy. And finally, the so-called war between science and religion dominates modern history. Each seeks to disenfranchise, devalue, and debunk the other. They see each other as enemies instead of spouses. By the way, the so-called war between science and religion is a total myth and an impossibility. If, and only if, we assume just one premise, that atheism is false. The necessary presupposition of the real existence of this mythical war between science and religion has to be atheism. For if there is a God who is not either stupid or wicked, and therefore does not tell lies, then faith and reason can never contradict each other, because they are both God's inventions, as St. Thomas said. Only if either faith or science lie can there be any contradiction, any war between them. And it must then be that faith lies, since neither side claims that science lies, though scientists can, and philosophy can lie and disguise itself as a science, as, for instance, in evolutionism as distinct from evolution. The result of the divorce between faith and reason is the death of both. Without faith, there is no faith in reason, so reason dies. And without reason, there is no reason for faith, so faith dies. The attempt to ground reason in itself in modern philosophy resulted in the present crisis of reason, each wave of the storm more destructive than the one before. Cartesian, universal, methodic doubt, Humean empiricism and skepticism, Kantian idealism, romanticist subjectivism, existentialist individualism, moral relativism, logical positivism, finally, linguistic deconstructionism. Every one of these philosophies, though contradictory to all the others in the direction toward which they move, are alike in the direction from which they move. They are all part of the grand strategy to dismantle the cathedral in which the marriage of faith and reason is celebrated. They all love different things, but they all hate and ignore the same thing, St. Thomas Aquinas. And the rebellion of faith against reason has been as destructive to faith as the rebellion of reason against faith has been to reason. The attempt to ground faith in itself, immanently, rather than transcendently, anthropologically or psychologically, rather than ontologically and theologically, this has resulted in the collapse of faith in liberal and modernist theology. The preening overconfidence and pride of both parties has become its opposite, a skeptical crisis of self-confidence. Autonomy has proved to be suicide. Now, this second stage, the fall or the divorce, does not last for any time at all in the Genesis account without the third stage beginning. As soon as the fall happened, God began its undoing, the redemption, a process that began in Eden, in Genesis 3:15, the proto-gospel, and was consummated on Calvary, but will not be complete until the apocalypse, the last judgment, the end of time. Until then, We Catholics continue to obey the command of our first Pope, St. Peter, who told us, "Be ready to give a reason for the hope that is in you." In other words, do apologetics. Apologetics shows the compatibility of faith and reason, Eve and Adam. So apologetics is marriage counseling. Adam and Eve must reconcile. They are meant for each other. If Adam and or Eve doubt this, they must be persuaded otherwise by these marriage counselors who are called Christian philosophers and apologists. There have been many such heroic marriage counselors. St. Justin Martyr, St. Augustine, St. John Damascene, St. Anselm, St. Bonaventura, St. Thomas Aquinas, Blessed Duns Scotus, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Newman, Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, John Paul the Great. They are all fingers on God's reconciling hands. Well, so much for the past, for history. What of the present and the future? I've been telling a double story here. A story about Adam and Eve, man and woman, and a story about faith and reason. My allegory makes it one story, but it's really two, because the fall has meant two things, has referred to two time periods. First, all the time since Eden. Secondly, more specifically, modern times. In this last scenario, the Middle Ages are a little more like Eden in that faith and reason and the marriage between them was much stronger. All three have been getting weaker for the last 500 years. And the same, coincidentally, is true of the relation between man and woman. Men have become less manly, woman less womanly, and the relationship less marital as modernity has worn on for the last 5 centuries. That sounds very pessimistic. But remember, the stage of redemption begins to be at work as soon as the fall happens. If the last 500 years have been a deeper and deeper fall, can we expect a return or a rise? Do I see the immediate future as better or worse for faith, for reason, and for their marriage? And while we're playing the prophet, what about the future of masculinity, femininity, and marriage? Well, to be very honest, I do not see our particular culture, either in the West in general or in America in particular, as immediately heading back or up, but rather forward and down. Transsexualism, unisexualism, gay marriage, the feminization of men, the masculinization of women, the secularization and trivialization of marriage all show no signs of turning or diminishing in the culture. But they do show such signs in the church, especially since divine providence has provided us with the church's deep answer to the sexual revolution, which is John Paul the Great's theology of the body, which has been like a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of sexuality. They're very templates. Less spectacularly, but just as really, there has been a revival of theological and liturgical orthodoxy and of a personalistic version of Thomistic philosophy, also associated with John Paul the Great. So it seems to me that as our culture becomes more toxic, the church becomes a more potent antidote. In other words, bad is getting badder, but good is getting gooder. Well, if this keeps happening, if the bad keeps getting worse and the good keeps getting better, what great conflicts does this bode for our future? Well, I cannot forecast their specific identity, although they will likely continue to center on these two themes, the marriage of the sexes and the marriage of faith and reason. Our current culture war between the culture of life and the culture of death is not a new war. It began in Eden, ever since a certain incident about a snake and an apple. It has been the central theme of all of our history. The culture of life is the culture of marriage. For life to go on, there must be marriage. If there is no marriage, there is death. And that is true intellectually, marriage for faith and reason, as well as biologically, marriage for Adam and Eve, man and woman. That is why two encyclicals every Catholic should read are Mulieris Dignitatem, on the dignity of woman, and Fides et Ratio, faith and reason. The struggle today between those who, like the Catholic Church, teach the total harmony and complementarity of faith and reason, as well as of man and woman, and those who directly or indirectly teach an opposition between these two. This struggle is a key part of the spiritual war between the two cultures, the culture of life and the culture of death, which is the ultimate meaning of human history. That is what St. Augustine told us long ago when he wrote the world's first and greatest philosophy of history, The City of God. He called them the two cities, we call them the two cultures. We're talking about exactly the same thing and the same war. As Scripture tells us, this is a war not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of wickedness in high places in the heavens. But its weapons are flesh and blood, ours and Christ's. It is really a war between two wars, between the devil's war and God's war. The devil's war is a war against neighbor, self, and God. God's war is a war against the world, the flesh, and the devil. The devil wants you to make peace with the world, the flesh, and the devil. And God wants you to make peace with neighbor, self, and God. The weapons of the devil's war are greed, lust, and pride. The weapons of God's war are poverty, chastity, and obedience. The war between these two wars is really the war between war and peace. I thank God for the privilege of fighting in this war on the intellectual areas of the battlefield, at least a little bit. I see many much holier warriors fighting on other areas of the battlefield. Exorcists, saints, popes, priests, spiritual directors, as well as honest and honorable lawyers, politicians, artists, storytellers, musicians, social workers, business persons, cops, soldiers, nurses, filmmakers, surgeons, psychiatrists, farmers, and comedians. These are all military vocations. There are very many different areas of the battlefield, but there's only one war, because there is only one God. And whoever is not for him is against him. And however long it takes, and however numerous the casualties, the outcome of the war is as inevitable as a tautology, because God is God. That is the supreme certainty of both faith and reason. Well, your purgatory is over, your heaven now begins. Talks are dull, question and answer sessions are always interesting. So I invite your reactions and questions. Just shout out your question, and if I don't hear you, I'll say shout a little louder, because we don't have a microphone. By the way, Catholic audiences are always very polite during talks because they believe in purgatory. They expect to have to wait to get to heaven. Now comes the interesting part. I just jumped a little bit on the diving board. Now we're going into the pool. There will be questions or the meetings will begin. Yes.
Can you really talk about God as being involved in war? If God is infinite, he can squash his opponents instantly.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you legitimately talk about God and war?
Well, let's take a parallel. Can you say that Shakespeare is involved in Hamlet? Does Shakespeare really love Hamlet and sympathize with him? And does he agonize over the need for him to fight the duel and to die, and his inner torment? Or is Shakespeare a deist who stands off and says, like Rhett Butler, frankly, my dear, I just don't give a damn? No good novelist can be like that. Nevertheless, Shakespeare is totally transcendent to Hamlet. He's immortal and impervious. He can't be killed. He can't be poisoned by anything in the play. So I think God has that double attitude. On the one hand, he's even more involved than we are, passionately involved in everything in our lives. On the other hand, he's transcendent and impervious. And if we could only cultivate that double attitude towards our lives, if we could only play our lives as you play a football game, with passion, as if it's a matter of life or death, yet at the same time realizing that it's only a game, that would transform our whole lives. And I think that's a key in Jesuit spirituality. Read Teilhard de Chardin's The Divine Milieu. That's, I think, a true classic of Jesuit spirituality. That's one of the points he makes there. You have to have a double attitude towards poverty and suffering and death and all these negative things. On the one hand, you have to fight like hell against them. On the other hand, you have to be detached and give them up to God. And if you lack either of those two, you're not completely human. Well, I'm not sure, theologically, whether it's metaphysically possible for the devil to be simply annihilated. He is by nature immortal, can't die. That's pretty pessimistic. In all the fairy tales, evil dies and they all live happily ever after. And even if we do all live happily ever after, there's going to be a terrible price to pay. Okay. Now, I think he certainly could squash the devil in every other possible way, because he's going to do that at the last day. He's going to be bound forever, and he's going to burn forever, and he'll never get out. And he'll never bother anybody in heaven. So why doesn't he do it now? Well, because he's more patient than we are. And he's a good storyteller. Shakespeare could have made Hamlet win in the middle of Act 1, but it wouldn't have been a great play. That's St. Thomas's answer to the problem of evil. He formulates the problem of evil, which is certainly the strongest argument for atheism, in a remarkably simple way. If one of two opposites is infinite, there's no room for the other to exist. But there is an infinite goodness, it's called God. Therefore, if there were such a God, there would be no room anywhere for evil to exist. So the existence of evil disproves the existence of God, at least a God of infinite goodness. And his answer is, this is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he allows evil to exist precisely because out of it he brings even a greater good, a dramatic good. Augustine is so bold as to say about the fall, "Oh, happy fault that brought about so great a redemption." Now, that's something we couldn't possibly predict. Take as an example, the one human being that we can be fairly certain is in hell eternally, Judas Iscariot. Because Jesus himself said, it would have been better for that man if he had never been born. That doesn't sound very hopeful. All right. Suppose there was no Judas, or suppose Judas got a conversion at the last minute and decided not to betray Christ. Well, then, where would we be? We couldn't be saved. The passion would not have been completed. Thank you, Judas. Judas is like Gollum in The Lord of the Rings. He's the one that completes the task. God's very tricky. So if that's not an adequate answer, God's got an adequate answer for us, and we'll eventually know it. That's for sure. So he allows evil. He could squash it. Why, for instance, doesn't he give us all the good things that we need and ask for? Why aren't our prayers magically answered? God, please convert my grandfather. He's going to die an atheist. God, please save my 2-year-old. He's dying of leukemia. And God often doesn't do it. Why? He could. He's got a better plan. I don't see it. Of course you don't see it. You're not me. That's what God said to Job. Who do you think you are anyway? Are you the author? Are you a buck private slogging through the muck in the war? Know thyself. We don't like that answer. It's not good enough, but that's the one we got. That was a long answer to a simple but profound question. I'll try to make the other answer shorter. Yes?
When you were talking, Doctor, you said about the church having true faith. Well, you know, in today's modern society, some people think that they have, it's so relative. Whatever individual has as his faith, that is, everybody should have their own faith. And that's so weak, because we become so autonomous, we think so independent, that the church is, if there are millions of people with their own faith, and it doesn't coincide with the one true faith, then we'll have nothing but chaos.
Well, you know what that means. True for me, but not for you, my faith versus your faith. You know what that means? Imagine a scientist saying that. Well, this is true for me, but not for you. You can't. Imagine a financial consultant saying that. Well, Fannie Mae is true for me, but not true for you. Imagine a geologist saying that. Well, this earthquake is going to happen for me, but not for you, even though we're both standing in the same spot. They couldn't possibly do that. Why not? Because they're talking about something real. But if I say, elves are beautiful for me, but scary for you, well, that's because elves are just psychological fantasies. And I feel differently about elves than you do. And that's all elves are, just feelings. So people who say that, true for me but not for you, are talking about something that they don't believe is real. They are functional atheists. There is a God for me but not for you. That's like saying there's a Santa Claus for me and not for you. Now, I very much respect an honest atheist who says, it is an objective proof and I can prove it by reason that there is no God. You're wrong. That's not relativism. That's an error, but it's not relativism. That's at least honesty. I suspect that honest, truth-seeking atheists who remain atheists all their lives have a better chance of getting to heaven than dishonest, subjectivistic, relativistic believers who believe just because it feels good.
What's your concept of the last day then? Is it a joyful getting back to the garden, or is it just...
Oh, no, it's much better. Much better. We wouldn't have been in the garden forever. That was a test. One thing I'm sure of, that we can't be sure of whatever we're in for, because God always has surprises. If they weren't surprises, then they'd be simply happiness instead of joy. Happiness is the satisfaction of your desires. That gets boring. Joy is a surprise. Suppose you want something like an expensive new car, and you work hard for it, and you finally afford it, and you buy it, and you've got it. Well, that's happiness, but it's not a surprise. And it's not really joy, unless the car surprises you. But suppose you never expected anybody to give you such an expensive present, and somebody does. That's much more joyful than just getting it by your own efforts. So, whatever heaven is, it'll be surprise. It'll be better than you think. Here's the Bible's definition of heaven. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man the things God has prepared for those who love him. Let's use an analogy. I think what we will experience at death is similar to what we experience at birth. We enter a whole new world which you couldn't possibly have suspected before. How could an embryo possibly imagine the University of Scranton? No way. So we have to be agnostic about heaven. You have to be trustful, but it's going to be surprising.
So is it the same thing as a finite mind can't grasp the end?
Yeah. And that's why heaven won't be boring. If it was finite, you could come to the end of it. Can't come to the end of it. New every day. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And all the pictures that we have of heaven are boring. There's never been a good movie about heaven. They've all been boring. Which means our imaginations aren't very good. But God certainly is. Look what he invented. Would we have ever invented ostriches? He's fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you for a fantastic and very exciting lecture. I was wondering when you said that if in the world, the bad is getting badder and the good is getting gooder, whether, since the apologists' vocation is sort of to bring things together, whether you can actually really be an apologist if you have a world where that's getting more toxic and it's just that's getting more churchish. Because it seems like in that situation you have a division that is actually hard to reach. So it seems like the position of the apologist is actually getting harder and harder. It's looking more and more like you're just going to have to
No. If good and evil are getting each stronger and they're opposites, then the distance between them is increasing. That's true. But the apologist doesn't want to bridge that distance. He wants to bridge the wrong distance between faith and reason. He wants to take these two estranged couples and put them back together. And they belong to each other. But the two sides don't belong together. Darkness and light don't belong together. In fact, one of the problems in modern times is that people don't see the difference between darkness and light so clearly. They're very suspicious of what they call simplistic thinking. So everything has to be nuanced. Everything is gray. Well, it's true that we can't judge human hearts, and there's a little good in the worst of us, a little bad in the best of us, but still good is good and bad is bad. It's we who are both good and bad, but good isn't a little bad, and bad isn't a little good. Those are absolute opposites. And the apologist business is to clarify the difference between good and evil and the similarity between faith and reason, both. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you believe Satan uses both faith and reason to contradict one another?
Well, he misuses both. He must experience great pain in having to use both of these God-invented things, because he doesn't like God-invented things. So he tries to twist them and pervert them. That's what evil is. Evil is always something good twisted. Nothing is evil in the beginning. That's a line from The Lord of the Rings, greatest book of the 20th century. Nothing is evil in the beginning. Even the devil was created as Lucifer, light bearer, greatest of the archangels. So he has to twist something. So he has to twist reason into something that's independent of truth. He has to twist faith into something that's independent of God. You almost have to pity the devil.
So that would be a very subjective kind of process?
Yeah, faith and reason are both ways of opening yourself to God's truth. And the devil isn't like that. So he wants to close the mind on itself. The devil's sin was pride. The devil wanted to be God. He didn't want to be number two. He wanted to be number one. He wanted to close in on himself instead of opening himself to God. So that's the fundamental temptation that he always gives to us. And there's a smell of that in every sin. By the way, that is why many sins that modern people don't understand are sinful, are not understood to be sinful by the modern mind, but really are, because they don't understand that demonic strategy, that fundamental principle of openness versus closedness. For instance, masturbation. Why is that wrong? Not just because the church says so, not just because it's against the law, but because it perverts the essence of sex, which is openness to the other. And it substitutes yourself for the other. Now, I'm not saying that's the most serious sin, but in every sin you find some kind of closedness in on yourself, where you're supposed to be open to the other and ultimately to God.
Right. The truth is very simple, but it's too hard for us to grasp.
Yep.
Therefore, we go deeper into our subjective mindset and it takes us further than we should.
Simplicity is harder for intellectuals to grasp than complexity, which is why the most insane ideas in the world are ideas that only a Ph.D. could possibly be suckered into believing. This is not to trash PhDs or education. It's just to say that if you're clever enough to construct very elaborate hiding places, you can do it pretty well. Farmers can't do that. Once upon a time, maybe 100 years ago, there were more farmers than PhDs. Now there's more PhDs than farmers. We're in trouble. Yeah.
Doctor, I apologize for mentioning this at the Jesuit University. But
Georgetown?
2 years ago,
No, he was going to say the bad word.
letter from the Dominicans, there as an eastern province, I believe the St. Joseph province. They have the largest class of postulants the past 50 years. And in the letter, the priest mentioned that he attributes this to their fidelity.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we could say the same about some of the other orders, which sadly are dying out.
Well, you've probably heard this before, but let me tell you the classic joke about the difference between the Jesuits and the Dominicans. The Dominicans were founded by St. Dominic.
Stand behind the microphone. Thank you.
The difference between the Jesuits and the Dominicans. The Dominicans were founded by St. Dominic in the 12th century to combat the heresy of Albigensianism. The Jesuits were founded in the 16th century by St. Ignatius Loyola to combat the heresy of Protestantism. How many Albigensians have you met lately? But the comeback to that is the equally classic joke about the Dominican and the Franciscan who were arguing about which order was the most important one in the church, and they said, we shouldn't argue about this. That's not a Christian thing to do. Let's ask God to settle it, and whoever is number two will humbly serve number one. So they wrote this letter to God explaining their problem and asking for a miraculous solution. And they put the letter on the high altar of the cathedral and stayed all night in the cathedral praying for a miracle. And in the morning, sure enough, there was a miracle. There was a hole in the roof, and down the hole had come a gold letter which was on top of theirs. And they opened it, and it was from God, and it says, "My dear children, you are all equal in my sight. Now stop fighting. Signed, God S.J." The church is like Noah's Ark. You know, it's got weird animals, and they sometimes smell, but we love them all of them. Yeah.
Dr. Kreeft, do you think that works of the imagination can play a role in bringing together faith and reason back together?
Works of the imagination play an essential and powerful role in apologetics. I know personally of a number of people who have recovered their faith through reading The Lord of the Rings, as agnostics or atheists. What imaginative literature does is like fertilizing the ground. And what apologetics does is like seeding. It's direct and conscious. But we know that the unconscious is much bigger and usually more powerful than the conscious. You can't argue with an image. You can argue with a concept. Now, the Christians in our culture have always been at the forefront of intellectual activity, all kinds of intellectual activity. We can be proud of our record on the level of the intellect. And we've also been in the forefront in morality, in moral seriousness, in preaching and practicing morality. And throughout the Middle Ages, the art that Christians made was the greatest art in the world. That's no longer the case. We don't make the great pictures and the great movies anymore. That's an essential mission field.
Why do you think that's so?
I don't know. I'm not a sociologist. I think I know a little bit about how we lost Harvard, but I don't know how we lost Hollywood. Yeah.
In your history of the divorce between faith and reason, where, if any place, would you fit Islam?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Well, Islam is one of the great Christian heresies. Muhammad learned, I think, about who the true God was and got a very accurate picture of that from Jews and Christians. If that's not so, if he made it up all himself, then he's the greatest philosopher in the history of the world, because he came closer to the nature of the true God than any other mind in history that used natural reason alone. But I don't think he didn't use natural reason alone. But he misunderstood the Bible, and he had misunderstood Christianity. He got some of it right and some of it wrong. And above all, what he missed is not just the divinity of Christ, that's the key doctrine, but the relationship to God that Christ makes possible. Muslims keep God at a respectful standoff. They tend to be functional deists, and that's very unfortunate. I wrote a book of Muslim-Christian dialogues, and I was very happy to see that it was criticized by both the left and the right. One thought I was much too favorable to Islam, and the other thought I was much too critical. Yeah.
You mentioned in your talk both reason and faith asserting their independence of one another. And you mentioned in that connection certain academic theologians who are the only ones who'd be convinced, I guess, by the ability of faith to stand on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind giving me a hint as to who or what trends you had in mind?
Well, let me first change the question a little bit. I didn't quite say that I was suspicious of the ability of faith to stand on its own. What I was suspicious of is the tendency of faith to justify itself as faith. I have faith in faith. That's a subjectivistic and relativistic kind of faith. So I mentioned Schleiermacher and Rousseau, both of whom reduce faith to a feeling. I'd say Bultmann also, and the demythologizers, are making not just a hermeneutical and historical mistake, but a religious mistake. because the religion that produces is not really the Christian relationship to God. You don't trust a myth. You don't have faith in a myth. You might find it very useful. I myself love mythology, and Tolkien loves mythology, but he wouldn't die for Norse mythology. So even if Christianity is the best mythology ever, it's not something to die for, and it's something you don't live.
Thank you for a great talk. And my question is, I'm teaching a couple teenagers. We're working through Aristotle's rhetoric.
Wow.
And, well, we're still at the beginning. And,
You must be a homeschooler.
how did you know? Yes, I am.
Nobody else has such high ideals and ambitions. Teaching teenagers Aristotle's rhetoric, that's great.
They are loving it, and I'm
Yep.
learning from them. They're understanding it better than I. Which is why I have the question for you. Just at the beginning, Aristotle tries to give us the definition of art and the definition of science, and that rhetoric is an art. And we're having a bit of a discussion, and I think it's because the modern thought has kind of taken the definition of art and science and perverted them a little.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could comment on, like, what is Aristotle, or really it's Western civilization's definition of what is an art, what is a science, versus what the modern world is teaching?
I don't think the modern definitions are perversions. I just think they're narrowings. Most words have broader meanings in ancient cultures than in modern cultures. So what Aristotle meant by a science is simply any organized body of knowledge whose end is truth. And what he meant by an art is any organized knowledge whose end is action. What we mean by art is usually art for art's sake, the fine arts. And what we usually mean by science is something you do by the scientific method, which is a narrowing down. And both may be respectable things, but the older definition comes first.
One follow-up. So would a sport, this will solve a problem in our home, is a sport an art, or is it a science?
Depends on the end. If the purpose of a sport is exercise and health, then it's an art. If the purpose of a sport is simply entertainment and relaxation, I don't think it's either an art or a science. Although, no, I take back that. No, even if the purpose of a sport is simply entertainment, you have to develop technique, you have to be good at it. And thus the art of doing that is an art, because you have to know it. Yeah, that's an art too. I love Aristotle because he forces you to think through things like that clearly, and oops, that's a mistake, and you can clearly see your mistake, and then come back.
To comment on the question about art and why it's going to decline, I think it was poet Ezra Pound, I'm not sure, but someone like that said that he observed that there's more bad art due to bad morality than there is to lack of talent. Bad moral is,
Well, I think that's true. Just visit the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Immense talent, immense technique, but the moral vision of the world there is so bleak that please don't go with a gun because you'll probably commit suicide afterwards in despair. But at the vision it gives you. So if you mean by morality this broad sense of what are true values and what is the meaning of life, I think he's right.
I have a comment on your, so you're doing the sports thing, you're saying a sport is
An art, yeah.
But I think the scientists have tried to narrow it and use science to improve sports. Like and they compartmentalize it.
There's a place for that.
Yeah.
There's almost always a place for specialization as long as it's a means to an end. As long as it perfects something larger than itself.
That's the problem, because you're perfecting yourself, you're not perfecting something larger than yourself.
Well, that's the turn on again, the turn in.
If you're perverting a sport.
Yeah, yeah. The only two things in the whole universe that exist for their own sakes is man and God. Everything else is a means to one of those two ends. And man himself is a means to the end of God. Yeah.
If you see good and evil on a linear track moving opposite directions, which is what you mentioned. That
I didn't say linear track.
Sorry. That they are moving, you said evil is becoming more evil and good is becoming a higher good. Do you think that's going to be an infinite process that keeps going, or do you
No.
think it's going to stop?
No, that's a good question. Historically, you see times like that. Let's say the Kingdom of Israel under Solomon, or the Roman Empire after Julius Caesar when it ceased to be a republic and began a little bit of corruption, or Athens after the Golden Age. You have problems, you have corruption, bad gets better, but God raises up saints and philosophers and great people to combat that. But that doesn't last forever. Then it goes through another cycle, ups and downs. So even when bad gets really bad and God raises up really great saints, like Mother Teresa, what a saint, wow, because the age is so bad, if she wins and evil gets less evil, then God doesn't have to raise up such extreme saints anymore. So then you get a quiet age. We're not entering a quiet age. We're entering a less quiet age.
So it's more of a cyclical process.
It's a cyclical process. But my point is that it's exactly the opposite from linear. As evil gets worse, good gets better. So I don't know how to balance those two. I don't know a single quantitative standard by which you can say, let's measure the good and the evil, and there's more good than bad. But just to take another instance, has there been moral progress or has there been moral regress in the last 1,000 years or the last 100 years? And my answer is both. I think there's been genuine moral progress in many areas: human rights, compassion, the importance of the poor, all the soft virtues we're better at than our ancestors. By our standards, they were cruel and insensitive. But all the hard virtues we're worse at. We're a bunch of spoiled sissies who are afraid of courage and afraid of honesty and chastity and all the hard virtues. So I don't know how to balance those two things out, but they're both there.
When looking at faith and reason, I guess from historical or throughout our history, currently as we talk about religion, trying to bring them together or show that they're connected, not necessarily separate. But do you think there was ever a time throughout man's history that there was a conscious awareness that they were meant to be together, or they were practiced?
Well, this is a rather embarrassing question because the answer is embarrassing because it's so obviously true and so obviously unpopular. It's called the Middle Ages. And though the Middle Ages were kind of cruel and barbaric in many ways, yet they were a wonderful success story with regard to the fundamental purpose. That was the fundamental theme of medieval culture, the marriage of these two things, and it worked. I guess I could identify myself as a typically modern coward because I wouldn't enjoy living in the Middle Ages, mainly because they didn't have anesthetics. Or indoor plumbing, yeah. It's like Woodstock without the drugs. Okay, yes.
The use of the scientific method is extremely prominent, obviously, in our society. And I noticed the sign on the building over here, the science of behavior. In talking to B.F. Skinner one day, I asked him this question. Since Walden 2 has never existed, nor therefore in your terms been operant, isn't in point of fact a faith? And that's what he did, was shake his head yes. We all live by faith. It's a question of what you put it in. what I would love to hear you comment on, you spoke of love and the Trinity, but anyone who loves wants to be known and understood as they are. And God loves and conveys himself to us, chooses to live through it and in you. Would you please comment on the each person called by name, baptism, and where God really is alive?
Well, let me give a Jesuit-themed answer to your last question. The reason we can find God in everything is that he is in everything. And the reason that he's in everything is that he's transcendent to everything. Because light doesn't have any color, because it transcends colors, it can be in all colors and bring out more color in every color. And because God is the infinite act of existence itself, not confined to any finite essence, therefore he can be present in any finite creature that has an essence, because every essence is actualized by existence, and that comes from the creative act of God. So the answer to the question, where do you find God, is everywhere. And the relation between that profound theoretical and practical truth on the one hand, and faith and reason on the other hand, is that it enables faith to get bigger and reason to get bigger, because reason is not just the process by which you move from one truth to another truth, which is essential to the scientific method. It's also seeing, contemplating the truth, standing in the light. That's the bigger, deeper sense of reason. And faith is not simply the propositions that you believe because of the authority of the God who revealed them. That's true too. But faith is fundamentally this primordial openness and trust to God himself as a person. So God is the ultimate object of both faith and reason. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's the thoughts that come to my mind in reaction to what you so profoundly said.
Your answer that you just gave there, the story of Job, is that why Job was the only one, even though he was the one that was getting all the grief, and all the other actors were saying, well, hey, God is dumping on you, just a person. But because his faith was that strong, that his reason was actually that much stronger to understand that God had a purpose.
His reason was stronger for that reason, and it was also stronger because it was Socratic. It knew his ignorance. The three friends didn't make any theological mistakes about God. Their theology was orthodox. They made mistakes about Job, but they were arrogant. They thought they knew all the answers, and Job knew that he didn't know all the answers. He had that Socratic wisdom. And even Job wasn't humble enough, because when God finally shows up and answers Job, he says, who do you think you are anyway? Were you there when I laid the foundations of the earth? And Job confesses he's been a fool. I was this man full of empty-headed words. And what satisfies Job was not anything God said. It was not words. It was not an intellectual answer. Because God didn't answer any of his questions. He just showed up. And Job's answer is, I had heard about you with the hearing of the ear. That's secondhand. That's faith in divine revelation. That's important. But now I see you with the seeing of the eye. Well, that's heaven. God gave Job a little bit of the beatific vision. There's nothing better than that. You don't want words after that. If God had given Job words, if God had written Job 2, answers to all Job's questions by the greatest theologian in the world, God. I think I know Job well enough to know what he'd do. He'd read that book and say, oh, God, these are terrific answers. Wow, thank you so much, God. Wait a minute, can I talk to you tomorrow? I got a couple of questions here about this. And then God would answer them, and Job would say, I got a couple of questions about your answer, and it would go on forever and ever and ever. And it would never end, like a little war. One soldier comes from one side, another soldier comes from another side, they fight, and then they're replaced. Well, the war ends, and peace consists in this tranquility of order by which we contemplate the ultimate truth. That's heaven. And that sounds boring to us because we think of truth as something abstract. But truth is something so concrete that it's a person. His name is Jesus Christ. And he's the only man in history who never bored anybody. Yeah.
And speaking about faith and reason kind of on the individual level,
Mm-hmm.
do you find it reasonable, the theory of the anonymous Christian theory by Bronner, that it kind of walks a tightrope between the dangers of relativism and then kind of this exclusionary triumphalism?
Insofar as I understand what Ronner means by the anonymous Christian, I hardly agree with it. I'm not an expert on Ronner. He may say some mistaken things about it, but I think it's essential to avoid those two extremes. The fundamentalist extreme of, I know you're going to hell, and the liberal extreme of, oh, well, we're all sort of in the same boat, let's just be nice. Furthermore, what gets you to heaven is not that you pass a theology exam at the Golden Gates and you're orthodox enough, so that people who are mistaken, sometimes badly mistaken, atheists maybe, or polytheists, their heart, in the scriptural sense of the word heart, not just their feelings and emotions, but their deepest will, is set on God, although they don't know God. The classic example here, of course, is Socrates, who was an agnostic, and who wasn't perfect, wasn't much of a family man, and he seemed to pay at least some serious homage to the polytheistic Greek gods. It was Plato who criticized them more severely. But Socrates paid for his honest search for truth with his life. He was a kind of secular martyr. Now, I myself would be very surprised not to find Socrates in heaven, because Jesus Christ himself says, all who seek find. Well, Socrates sought the true God with his life, and for him not to find what he sought so passionately, probably more passionately than most of us do, would be an injustice. Now, I have no speculations, certainly no information, about the comparative population statistics of heaven and hell. When the disciples asked Jesus, Lord, are many going to be saved? His answer was not yes, nor was it no. It was strive to enter in. Otherwise, mind your own business. But we got to keep the gates open. God can close them, we can't.
Well, I think to all of you, the faithful remnant, we should give Dr. Kreeft one last round of applause. I'm sure he'd be pleased to talk with you if